Nathaniel, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you so much. Great to be here with you.
We've been talking for like the last 15 minutes on the pre-show, and this is unexpected where I believe this conversation is going to go, and I'm so excited to have you on. Let people know kind of what you do. I know that you're a leadership expert. You work on a lot of leadership, but you've also gone through this journey of, spirituality, East meets West. Take us kind of on that journey.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, excuse me. The origin story, as I like to call it, was being raised in a community that practiced transcendental meditation. And it's still there today in Fairfield, Iowa. So I had that influence of Eastern spirituality growing up. And I was also raised, with Western Judaism. And the school system, built in meditation every day. We were kind of graded on whether we showed up to meditate, and also had spiritually integrated curriculum. So it wasn't just studying a discipline for the sake of that discipline, but also with the understanding that it was about the development of consciousness and spiritual awakening. And so it was interesting to have that during the day, and then to, be raised going to Sunday school, preparing for bar mitzvah, all of that. And then to, as many Jewish men do, they leave that behind after the bar mitzvah. And I think I went to high holidays. I was one of those kind of seasonal Jews. But there was something always within me that I associated with the sacred, much through the music and the melodies. So that never left me, and was always part of whatever I did. I pursued the martial art of Aikido, which is a very spiritually integrated martial art. It's about nonviolent conflict resolution and how to control an opponent without hurting them. A lot of circular movements like in judo. And I actually lived in a dojo for 2 years.
Wow.
As a live-in student. And I think the reason that's important in my own through line is the kind of table stakes for community of practice since I was born is everyone in the community. There's like 3,000 people out of 10,000 people in that little town in the cornfields in Iowa. They're meditating together before and after work. And then I got into martial arts and the discipline of that. You train every day. And then to be in a live-in student environment where people were actually showing up from all over the world to be in this kind of service and action learning and training every day. And so I think whether you call it a dojo or a sangha in Buddhism or a community of practice, that's really been important to me. And it's also, to answer your question about what I do now, that became the metaphor for my leadership development work. So I was an executive coach for a 1-year integral leadership program, which is based in Dallas at the Stegan Leadership Academy. Really beautiful work and a very transformative program. Most programs are not a year long. You get the kind of edutainment, 1 or 2 day training or afternoon training. And it's like, well, Picasso didn't learn to draw in an afternoon. You're probably not going to learn to be a great leader in an afternoon either.
Couldn't agree more.
But even after a year, it was like, we'd wave goodbye to people. And then they kind of go back to their businesses and maybe back to their old habits, maybe not. So I really set out in 2015 to, disrupt leadership training. Sounds dramatic, but all I meant by that was I wanted it to be a permanent fixture in the business. That wasn't just for leaders, and it wasn't a training. It didn't start and stop. And that again was the principle of my upbringing. We had that community growing up, and I think so often today, to make it religious, I would say there is a kind of religious shaped hole in society and maybe inside of each one of us. I think Douglas Murray is the one I heard say that originally. And a good part of that is we're just seeking connection and tribe and, family beyond our immediate families. So I've tried to create this kind of corporate sangha or the in-house coaching thing where going to work can help you be a better person. And that when you show up, that's your tribe. And they're your tribe, just like on the mat in martial arts, because it's not just a place where you support each other, but you also challenge each other. You work through the tough stuff. So that's really where one of my specialties is as well, is getting the executive team dynamic right and helping them do conflict well. That's where the martial arts metaphors come in handy as well. So really doing culture transformation at that team level first, and then helping scale the leadership development with peer coaching, having everyone in the organization learning to be a coach. So
Love that, man. I want to go back really quickly. First of all, I love leadership. It's what I do full time as well. So kudos to you for building more leaders in this world. I think it's important. Um, coming from a meditation space of meditating twice a day before and after work, and then coming into, I guess, the real world. At some point, you moved out of Iowa, came to California, seeing that people didn't meditate. What was that like for you?
It's a great question, actually, because I might even say we felt sheltered growing up, being part of a spiritual community in that way. And it was a college prep, high school and everything else, but there's ways in which you don't feel prepared for the world. And so coming out to both to California and Texas as well, I think for lack of being in the world in the same way, I went kind of into overdrive and the achiever mode and burnout. So I really, it's like overcompensating almost. You're like swinging the pendulum from having a spiritual focus to like, now I got to make up for it and be in the material world. And that cost me pretty dearly. My body got wrecked doing martial arts, and just, you lose sight, you take for granted what you were given growing up. I think in some ways I would say that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of meditation, and we talked about this before a little bit, is about being self-aware, right? Knowing what you're feeling, knowing what you want, just being at peace. That word self-aware gets thrown around a lot. What does it mean? And why is it important to us as Jewish men to really dive into self-awareness? I mean, are you happier? Do you make more money? Like, what's the point of becoming more self-aware?
Well, to tie the two together, what you do once you're aware, that's leadership. So awareness is the first step. And we have so many defenses against being made to be aware. I like to say that the biggest barrier to conscious leadership is unconscious leadership. It's a moot point in some sense. Anyway, we're all leading by our example. So the question is, what is our example? And are we willing to have the mirror held up? For Jewish men, let me put it to you this way. What's been evolving in my own process is this notion of the word covenant and what that has to do with core values. The covenant means to come together to form agreements as part of a community, but not just in a way that we transact with one another. It's like, what are our agreements at a core value level? That's what a covenant is. How do we want to treat one another? And the first covenant we know that we're in is with what is higher than the ego. There is a higher power. And when we're triggered or reacting out of our ego, that's when the unconscious part of us is taking over. So I think the first pressure test, and you see this in organizations too, or in government, what makes a democracy a democracy? It's freedom of speech. There's a check and balance on that otherwise tyrannical power. So to put it in practical terms, if you say you value something, it's not just important that you say you value it. It's like, are you going to reflect and look in the mirror and see if you walk your talk? And are you going to empower other people around you to be that mirror for you as well, and not be defensive when they have the courage to speak their truth to you? That, again, is the difference between being a dictator in your world and being a conscious leader who's creating a kind of democratic culture around learning and growth.
You brought up freedom of speech, and you said something to me that this is very timely, you being on the podcast. I couldn't agree more. I did a video yesterday saying how I'm tired of wearing a mask, that I'm tired of tiptoeing around and not speaking my truth. Why do you think it is that so many men, wear this mask, put, duct tape over their mouth and don't speak their truth, when the covenant, when we're talking about like freedom of speech and freedom of choice, a lot of this is about being able to speak your truth so that you can be self-aware.
Exactly right. I mean, they even talk about in organizations, 80% of people have the water cooler conversation about their boss's blind spot, and they don't have that conversation with their boss.
Yeah.
And that lines right up with the studies on self-awareness that say only about 20% of people are actually self-aware. But of course, everyone says they are. So how do you begin down that journey to make sure that your ego isn't the thing that's in control? And it's again, this notion from Carl Jung of the shadow, the unconscious. It's like you talk the talk, but do you walk the talk? And so what we have leaders do first is I facilitate them through this process called the work, which is a process of self-inquiry. And it starts from the point where you're feeling triggered or in judgment of others. And there's a psychological truth there that, you know, when you point the finger, there are these three inconvenient fingers pointing back. So my judgments of others are a mirror for what I'm not conscious of in myself. And that's one way to make the unconscious conscious. And
No, go ahead.
Well, on the mat, it's the same thing. Like you need a mirror or a training partner. You need game film. You need to look at yourself. If anyone who's ever been in one of those booths where you do your golf swing and it videos you, like that's painful. Like it looks ugly when you first see that for the first time. And that's kind of what it's like. And no wonder we have a lot of defenses up around hearing other people's perspectives, basically.
And also, do you think, I think that a lot of people, you know, hide, especially as Jewish men. You know, I was raised that everything needs to be perfect. I had a great mother who taught me that I was perfect, right? Even though I'm not, we're taught that we must be successful. We're taught that we cannot make mistakes. We're taught, a lot of this is taught within, not Judaism, but within the Jewish community sometimes, which I think just puts more and more masks, and we come out with ego as opposed to self-awareness when we're just having conversation with our spouses, with our friends. We're afraid to talk about the truth. We're afraid to show what's actually wrong, what's hurting. And that's detrimental.
Yeah. And I definitely want to answer your question before as well. Like, why do we not speak our truth? And where does this conditioning come from about having to be perfect? I was just working with a client this morning, and yeah, there's so many internalized messages, beliefs that we have where we're in judgment of ourselves. And it can be, Jung talked about this too. It's just as scary to re-own your positive projections. Sometimes we pedestalize other people or become envious or look at them or what they have. And it's very hard to acknowledge our own strengths sometimes, because with that comes the need to be personally responsible for actually creating something as the leader of our own lives. That seems more daunting, not just because like, who am I to be great? But what if I try and I fail? And so that would be one reason. And then again, what do you do with the places where you're locked up? What if you can't help it? What practices do we have, and how do we support each other? And that's what I think is so important about, we can't do this alone. No one goes on this journey alone. So how can we be more conscious or deliberate about how we sit in circle with one another as men? Especially, I think that's so valuable. And a colleague of mine he's a pastor, and he was in the church for decades. And then he showed up to a Christian men's group, and he witnessed the kind of transformational work being done that he'd expected to have found within kind of the orthodoxy, but it was being done on a very relational, personal level. So I think that's part of what's happening these days, again, as we're seeking to find our tribe.
I love that. You know, my father passed away about 7 months ago, and
sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I go to, you know, synagogue almost every day to say Kaddish, and there is a sense of when I'm surrounded by 10 men, even if we're just praying together, not necessarily speaking to each other, but in each other's presence and energy, that it's healing in a way, right? I sit there, I've got my tefillin on, my talit on, and they're praying with me, and I'm not alone in essence. Yeah. And so I want to go back real quick, because I want people to know that essentially you did a lot of, you do meditation, you grew up in a TM world, yet you kind of came back to the spirituality of Judaism in a way. You had this experience where something came about where it kind of brought you back and opened up to it. Tell us a little bit about that. Sure
thing. And just to mirror what I was hearing there's something about the minyan Like that's for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's wisdom. You know, the reason why I started Tribesmen was to help Jewish men grow, become better leaders, looking at through the lens of the wisdom of Judaism. Obviously, I'm not a rabbi. I don't know the Torah, the Mishnah, any of that stuff, but there's wisdom there. And yet a lot of us, you know, because we don't understand it, if we're not Orthodox or religious, we kind of tend to shove it to the side and say, this doesn't belong to me. I can't relate to it in any way, shape, or form. But even as a small thing like the minyan, to me, that's brilliant because I'm not alone.
Right. And this stuff is, whether we identify as Jewish in our minds or not, it is ingrained into our DNA for thousands of years. And how is it that in my own Jewish mind, and as a coach, or the fact that you're a coach as well, how is it that we know how to make meaning of situations, to extract the meaning from it, the core values, the purpose, the vision? How is it that we know how to be the principle of conscience, you know, to have a sense of right and wrong? Well, because, you know, we sat around debating all that stuff for thousands of years, and it's somehow built into us. A nation of priests, you know, everyone, that was another covenant, you know, that we're raised and educated as if we're all rabbis in some sense, at least traditionally. We were, in the same way that Sparta was a nation of warriors. You know, so there's something very ingrained in us about that. And so for me, to pick up where I left off, I kept that sense of the sacred through the melodies. I think really there's something soulful and so familiar, and that connected me back to really my grandparents, especially my mother's parents, and something that felt like love or family or something stable in my life. My parents were divorced when I was 6, so I looked up to my Zadie, I think, also as a father figure. And my father and I are very close as well now, and also took a lot of work. But the experience I had, first of all, understand being raised in meditation, it's kind of the meditator's bias around substances. So I have still to this day never smoked a single thing short of a peace pipe in a Native American ceremony. So was not into drugs or partying growing up. I didn't drink till I was 23 or something like that. So really a good boy, you know, on the program, as they'd say. But then as I was leaving my job in Texas as an executive coach, I had a very dear friend, similarly into spiritual practice and coaching, consulting, and integral theory, which was, my degree was in integral psychology. And his fiance at the time was clinically depressed, and nothing really was helping her out that much. And one of his good friends was one of my grad school professors in psychology, and he was just seeing the research on psilocybin, you know, popularly known as magic mushrooms. All I did was read the Michael Pollan article that had come out, ironically, or not, that same month, February 2015. And it describes the Johns Hopkins research, which is on a single high dose of psilocybin. To this date, the numbers are somewhere around 75% of people say it is one of the 5 most spiritually significant moments of their life. And the remaining 25% say it is the single defining mystical experience of their life.
Wow.
And so I read that and I'm like, well, what is going on in there? Like, I need to know, as we do with Jewish minds, like we need to know for ourselves. And my first experience was basically a religious, not basically, it was a religious experience, and it transformed my worldview overnight. And at the peak of that experience, it was a kind of radical emotional exorcism and being taken into another realm. I felt like I was cashing in on 35 years of meditating. And it was the proverbial, they say like 5 years of therapy in 5 hours. But at the peak of it, when it got very still after that storm of emotion, I could feel, you know, Moses in the desert, or the Christ principle. And then it just bottomed out. And Jewish prayers came that I had not heard in 20 years. And what was it? It was Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Adonai Tsevaot, Eloka haaretz kevodo. So I had a very transformational God experience. And so within, I woke up out of that, and it felt like a religious experience because it was a blessing and an affirmation of the life process. It wasn't like the Eastern thing where you wake up from it and it was a dream. I felt like a rabbi. I wanted to bless everything. Like the breath coming in and out of me was a sacrament, was a blessing. The food on the table was a blessing. So from there, I didn't know what to do. And so I turned back to some of the practices I was raised with and started singing. It took about a year. I think I had one more journey, and that pushed it over the hump. And I, began singing my prayers, in the morning, sometimes morning, noon, and night, and just learning shacharit blessings for Shabbat as well, and Friday night. So it really did bring me back to considering how to live in blessing.
I love that. I got goosebumps when you were talking because you don't know this, but I do a lot of singing at my synagogue. And there's something about the prayers that when sung beautifully, I'm not saying I'm a beautiful singer, but when sung like just beautifully, I can close my eyes. Sometimes I've cried. For the high holidays, we hire a Chazan from Israel, and he comes in Iran. He's a great friend of mine, and he sings. And it's a feeling of connectedness that I don't get when I'm, by myself. So sometimes I'll pray in silence, and it's not the same as me praying out loud because I hear the words, I hear the tones, the connections of what might be, like you said, my generations, the past generations, who sang the same, who connected the same way. So in turn, for me, when I do that, I feel like I'm connecting to my ancestors with song, and the trials and tribulations and the blessings that they had all come into one space of music. Like, I'm a big fan of music. So, when you're talking about that, I don't think it's crazy whatsoever. I think it's beautiful, especially, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. And there's some things in prayer that when you read them, it makes a lot of sense. And you said something about blessing. Probably a couple of months ago, I started just once in a while, saying the blessing on the water and saying the blessing sometimes when I go to the bathroom. And at first I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is like, it's overboard when Orthodox people say it so much. But then you realize, man, I don't have to do anything for that water. I just, took it out of a gallon thing. The food, it's at my table. I heat it up. Like, everything is blessing. And I think that bringing it back to self-awareness is that when we realize how blessed we are with what we have, I think it's a catalyst to self-awareness. Because when you're so stressed out in the world, when there's so much going on, being self-aware is tough. But when you can look at things through the lens of blessing, I think it's easier to sit with yourself and say, okay, let me take a breath. Let me feel the blessing. Let me just see what I want and speak my truth from a place of blessing and not from a place of, the word just left me, of not having, right? A scarcity. Thank you. From a place of scarcity.
That's so beautiful. I would say again, too, that for thousands of years, we've had this built-in like emotional release mechanism. It's called the wailing wall for a reason. And it's a way I've found to find my own voice, because I noticed how self-conscious I was initially of singing those prayers or being heard or seen. And there's this strange dynamic of like wanting to be seen and then being afraid to be seen for who you really are, which is Brene Brown's definition of vulnerability itself.
Yep.
So we have that built-in release valve in some sense. And sometimes sitting and being still is beautiful in meditation, but to sing from that space, I think that's where the East and the West come together in a beautiful way. Like you're saying, blessing, the word blessing. I mean, Jews believe that it's God's presence that does the blessing, and that's what we're transparent to. when we're blessing something? Well, in the East, they call that mindfulness. And I sat with a rabbi one time, and I said, well, why? He said, there's no monks in Judaism. I was like, well, I never thought about that. Why is that? And he's like, well, on the one hand, if creation is a blessing, but you gorge yourself on it, then you're no better than an animal. But on the other hand, if you deny life, then what has it been created for? And I thought he's talking about the middle way, the principle in Buddhism. And it's not if you consume something or not, it's how you consume it. It's with that quality of mindfulness and presence. And you said it so well, like to realize that everything that I ever could have or be or need is always already present. Like there's something within me that is blessing, and it comes out of me. It doesn't come from the things I get or don't get. And that's a very mystical space to start living into. And that's what the plant medicines are just incidentally pointing out as well. Like life is the journey. And can you surrender and trust life? Like those experiences are just showing us how to metabolize life. Life is the blessing.
Two things came at me while you were saying that. You spoke about when you got out of your psychedelic journey that you wanted to just bless things, right? And I think that sometimes we forget to do that because we don't see it as much. We're taught, or we think that we have to go to the rabbis to get a blessing, or we have to put the piece of paper in the kotel to get a blessing, right? But what if we were to bless each other? Just put a hand on the head, or just shake one's hand and say, I bless you. May you be happy. May you be healthy. There's a big word in Judaism, parnasah, which means like abundance, right? And people take it as money, but it's also the abundance of health and happiness and all that type of stuff. And, rarely, I don't think ever have I gone up to a friend and said, man, can I bless you? I just want to wish you the best. And what if we started doing that?
I didn't even know about that tradition on Friday Night Shabbat until I met Orthodox friends in Dallas.
That's beautiful.
That is so beautiful. Like he eventually called me up as if I was one of his kids.
Yeah.
And how far back does that go? And what really is going on there, that transmission?
I have three daughters, and I do it every Friday night. And every time I do it, I get emotional. The first time I did it with my first daughter, I bawled like a baby, right? Because there was a power to blessing my child. And I think something that sometimes we just move through the motions and we forget about being self-aware and the blessings and the gratitude that we need to have to what we do have, right? So let me ask you this, Nathanael, for those listening, and we've taken them on a journey from like where you've been and self-awareness, all type of stuff. Give us 2 things that somebody can do to become more self-aware, to start the practice of self-awareness, in order to feel the blessing, in order to be able to feel more peace when they put their head on the pillow.
Great question. Well, at the risk of being challenging or risque, I would say to all Jews, all the Jewish men listening, to all human beings, these plant medicines, they've been buried in history and repressed in some way. It's not what you think from the 60s and 70s. Check out Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key. It's the secret history of the religion with no name. It goes all the way back into ancient Greece, how these Eleusinian mysteries, like at the center of that was a psychedelic potion, is what was alleged. So these mystical experiences have been part of cultures for thousands of years, even the cultures that gave rise to Western civilization. So just know that the times they are changing, and that you can have your own direct mystical experience, and that it may reinforce your faith in what you practice, because there doesn't need to be that intermediary. You can know, as the Greeks say, know yourself, which I take to mean know for yourself. Again, as a Jewish mind, I needed to know for myself. I wasn't going to believe it from someone else. So just know that psychedelic renaissance is occurring, and as and when it's appropriate in the most sacred of contexts, that you can have that experience. And then secondly, you need to integrate that experience. because you can be careful what you ask for. The doors of perception open, as Aldous Huxley said. And then you will, just like with any peak state, like you have an amazing trip even, and you feel so open, let alone some kind of spiritual experience. And then you tend to collapse back to your underlying belief structures, which can be very frustrating. So to be in the practice of self-awareness is the practice of self-inquiry. And again, I use the work for that. So I would point people to thework.com. They have a helpline that's always free, whatever you need, worksheets, everything else, just to start to be in the practice of self-inquiry. The other simple way to do that is join a men's group, hire a coach, leadership coach, clarify what your values are, but don't just put them on the wall like a Dilbert mission statement generator. You need to walk the talk. You need to take it off the wall and reflect. Where's the gap between my walk and the talk this week? Who do I owe amends to for that? And then what can I do differently this coming week? So I think those would be some really simple things.
I also think that, when I think about like wrapping tefillin or tefillin, as some people say it, for me, I always, I think about what's in my heart, what's in my mind. It gives me a moment of peace, of self-reflection. With that said, I have a really good friend of mine who it's the step right below ayahuasca. I forget what it's called, but he said it was
psilocybin.
I don't think it was mushrooms. Like it was like a plant that they did and he drank it. I'll hopefully remember the name at some point, but he also said it was life-changing. I mean, I saw him with more peace. Rabbi Eli Beda, who was on the podcast some episodes ago, talks about, plant medicine, and he's a big fan of psychedelics. So I think like this episode of the podcast, I think for me, the most important thing is to know that the journey of self-awareness just needs to begin, because once self-aware, and I see it in you, I saw it in my friend, there's a piece where you can be more present as a father, as a community member, as a spouse, as a friend, to come in a place with no judgment, peace, no defense mechanism, to be able to speak your truth. And that, I think, when you talk about covenant, is what higher power, God, is what he or she wants from us, right? It's like just live in peace, enjoy, and don't wear this mask continually as to be who you're not.
Yeah, beautiful. That is the fundamental covenant. They say the opposite of faith isn't doubt, it's control. And we know the story about where Jacob got his name, wrestling with God. And the founder of the work would say, I call reality God because it rules. But when you argue with reality, you lose, but only 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So this is what judgment is. This should be, that shouldn't be. Like I'm playing God. I'm in my ego.
Yeah.
So to really let go and let God, to really trust. I think of the Shema as that for me, because it's Shema Yisrael. Well, that's the part in me who's arguing with God, who's wrestling with God. It's a reminder to my ego that he is the one and not me. And I do it until I drop it, until I let go. And then, that will be done.
Man,
I'm responsible, but not in charge.
That's so beautiful. I think also in what you're saying is just to take our time, right? When you say Shema Yisrael, Adoshem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, like just take your time. And if you don't know it, because a lot of my friends say, oh, it's not for me. But what you did was you said, let me study it. Let me see what's here. Like the Jewish mentality of thousands of years ago. And then you found a connection. You dove deep into that connection. That connection gave you the ability to get away from your ego and to be able to continue in prayer and your day, knowing that there's something above and beyond your ego. So I think my challenge, you gave a challenge. My challenge is to don't step away from Judaism because you don't understand it, but try to understand it first, really dive into it, and then create your way of having that self-awareness, that peace, because there is beauty and wisdom in what's been around for thousands of years.
Yeah, there's a beautiful polarity there too, where it doesn't have to be either or. It can be both and.
Yeah.
I think you can be the sameness and difference. You can be very deep in one tradition, your own tradition, and you can be open to the universal truth that's in many traditions and have that deepen your appreciation for what's at the core of your own. And I think that's what's so important, that we could hold both. But there is some universal truth. We're all human. We have more in common with each other than we have apart.
Yes.
And hopefully that can help us appreciate where we come from as well.
Nathanael, this has been beautiful. Seriously, man.
Yeah. Really enjoyed it, Yigal. Yeah.
You know, the conversation that we had on the pre-roll, I was excited, and I'm even more excited to have gotten to know you in these last 36 minutes that we've been on board. For those of you listening, listen to this again. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Tribesmen podcast. Share it with a friend. I think that people need to hear this. I do. Coming from Nathanael, the other guests on the show, that it's about, you know, when I called this Tribesmen, it's about finding brotherhood in us, finding that minion of men who can support us and allow for us to be more self-aware, be more present, be more loving, and not stress, worry, and be so overwhelmed like many of us are today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed connecting too, and hope we can stay connected as we go.
For sure. Tribesmen, thank you so much for listening. Join us on the Facebook group for more conversations, and stay tuned for the next episode of the Tribesmen podcast.